Why was everyone so certain failure was the only option? Caleb kept his cheek pressed against the cold steel of the rifle, the scope's reticle dancing over chaos 2 kilometers away. The world had shrunk to glass, crosshairs, and breath. Nothing else mattered: the wind that screamed through the valley, the chatter in his earpiece, even the frozen December air tearing at his skin. All of it dissolved until there was only one fragile thread left, a child's life hanging by seconds. Ivan's guttural voice carried across the barricades. His words were half fury, half prophecy. "If I pull this trigger, the world will watch your daughter die." Caleb's finger hovered above his own trigger, but his body refused to close the distance. The target wasn't clean. It wasn't even close. Was hidden behind a wall of brutalist concrete, his rifle angled against the trembling temple of a girl no older than 8. The child's tears streaked dirt and fear down her face. Her tiny lips moved in silence, a prayer maybe, or just the desperate murmurs of someone too young to understand that the world could end like this, swift, meaningless, at the whim of a man who had already given himself over to death. Beside Caleb, Logan Price's voice cracked through the storm. "Boss, it's impossible. 2,300 meters, crosswinds at 20 knots, shifting every half minute. That barrier covers 80% of him. 1 degree off and we hit her. 2 and we miss entirely. This isn't skill. This is a coin toss in a hurricane." Caleb's jaw tightened. His life had been a ledger of risks, some carefully calculated, some gambled with blind instinct. But never had the balance sheet looked this grim. For 20 years he had been the one called when the situation demanded perfection. The man who could thread bullets through the eye of chaos. But perfection had boundaries. Even he knew when the universe whispered no. Yet there she was, a little girl trembling, staring directly through his scope as though she could see him across the impossible distance. Her eyes were not pleading, they were trusting. That was worse. Trust burned like acid. It cut through training and rules. It forced the question that had no answer: if not him, then who? "Overwatch, we need a solution." The commander's voice bled through his headset, urgent, commanding. "Negotiator says he's escalating. 2 minutes before he starts executing hostages." Caleb swallowed. His mouth was dry, his hands damp despite the freezing air. He adjusted the parallax, hunting for an angle that didn't exist. Leaned out to scream again, fragments of his face visible for a heartbeat before disappearing behind the wall. No shot. No hope. And then the sound of silence. It was not the silence of hesitation, nor the empty pause of a sniper's discipline. It was something colder, the kind of silence that arrives a fraction of a second before reality bends. A crimson mist burst from Skull. His eyes widened once, and then his body folded like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His weapon clattered to the concrete. The little girl stumbled free, untouched. No flash. No report. No sound. Just death, surgical and absolute. Caleb froze. His own finger was still resting against the guard, nowhere near the trigger. Logan gasped beside him, his spotting scope sweeping frantically across the valley. What the hell just happened? Lay sprawled in a widening pool of his own blood, a perfect headshot, the kind that belonged to textbooks, not firefights. Yet no one had fired, not them, not any Overwatch team. There had been no muzzle flash from the hills, no echo rolling back through the valley, nothing. It was as though the bullet had materialized from the air itself. The radios erupted with chaos, SWAT moving in, medics scrambling, commanders shouting for confirmation. But Caleb's voice was the one that carried the weight of disbelief. "Command, this is Overwatch. Target is down. Hostages appear secure." His tongue felt heavy, the words dry. "But we did not take the shot. Repeat, we did not fire." Static filled his ear. Then sharp, disbelieving authority. "Overwatch, confirm your last. Did you say you did not engage?" "That's correct," Caleb forced out. Each syllable cut him like glass. "Unknown shooter. position undetermined. The silence that followed was worse than any reprimand. Because in that silence, Caleb knew a truth he could not explain. Someone else had just reached across 2 kilometers of storm, concrete, and chaos to pull off the impossible. And it wasn't him. Logan's hands shook as he checked and rechecked his instruments. "Boss, I had the grid covered. No flash, no movement, nothing. It's like the bullet came out of nowhere." He turned pale as ash. But that shot, that wasn't chance. That was deliberate. That was surgical. Caleb's scope swept toward the northeast sector. Construction sites, empty cranes, shadows that had been written off as irrelevant hours ago. For a split second, a shimmer caught his eye, a glint of something unnatural, but when he focused, it was gone. Whoever had made that shot hadn't just saved a child. They had made a statement, a message written not in words but in silence and blood. And though no one else could see it, Caleb felt it in his gut. It wasn't a miracle. It was her, what happens when the laws of physics stop making sense. Caleb stared through the scope long after his body had collapsed, as though the glass might give him answers reality refused to provide. He could still see the child, sobbing in her father's arms. He could see the crimson halo splattered across the concrete, proof of a kill so precise it should have been impossible. And yet the impossible lay bleeding below. Logan's voice trembled with disbelief. "Boss, I swear to God there was nothing. No flash, no trajectory, no disturbance. It's like the bullet just appeared." Caleb pulled his eye away from the glass, his chest heaving against the weight of a truth he couldn't articulate. He had spent 2 decades trusting one thing above all else, the straight line of a bullet, a promise of geometry and physics, unbending, unforgiving. But tonight, that promise had been broken. The radio crackled again. "Overwatch ground teams are securing the hostages. Repeat, hostages are secure. We need confirmation on shooter identity." Caleb's throat felt raw. Negative on ID. Shot came from unknown position. It was the only answer he could give, though it made him feel like a fraud. He was the Overwatch, the one meant to see everything, predict everything, account for every shift of wind and shadow. But he had seen nothing. And worse, he had felt something. A presence. A shadow that hadn't come from the wind or the storm, but from somewhere deeper, colder. He kept his rifle trained on the northeast, on the hulking skeleton of a construction crane that loomed over the valley. Logan followed his gaze. "There," Logan whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. The crane was too far, the angles too steep. Even if someone had been up there, the geometry alone would have made the shot laughable. A bullet doesn't bend around corners. A projectile doesn't phase through concrete. That crane should have been nothing more than steel and shadow. But Caleb had been in this game long enough to know when a ghost was whispering from the dark. "Get ground teams sweeping that sector," he ordered, his voice hardening. "Every inch, every structure, I want it cleared." Logan's reply was immediate, but his tone betrayed the futility. "Already on it, boss. But if someone was there, they're long gone." The tactical channel dissolved into a storm of competing voices. SWAT reporting clears, medics calling out vitals, commanders demanding answers. But Caleb tuned it all out, his focus locked on the crane. It wasn't just about where the shot came from. It was about what the shot meant. Someone had taken the impossible and made it real, and they had chosen to reveal it, not hide it. The child could have died, could have carried his madness into bloodshed, but instead, at the exact second the world teetered on the edge, death arrived with surgical precision, too precise for chance, too perfect for luck. It wasn't just skill, it was intent. Logan lowered his scope and looked at him, face pale, eyes wide. Whoever did that, it wasn't about saving the girl, not really. It was about us, about making sure we saw it. The word struck Caleb harder than the cold. Because he knew Logan was right. The valley filled with the thrum of rotor blades as news helicopters circled like vultures. Sirens wailed. Cameras pointed at the scene where a child lived because someone in the shadows had decided she should. Caleb's hand brushed the safety of his rifle, almost reflexively. The weapon suddenly felt obsolete, a relic of an older age. He had always believed the battlefield belonged to discipline, patience, and physics. But tonight, the battlefield had been rewritten by someone who answered to none of those rules. When the order finally came to, Caleb hesitated. He kept his eyes locked on the crane until the last possible second, waiting for a flicker, a shimmer, anything that might explain the impossible. But the steel skeleton remained still, indifferent, holding its secrets like a grave. By the time they reached the perimeter, chaos had settled into grim efficiency. SWAT herded survivors toward ambulances. Medics triaged wounds. Reporters shouted questions that no one dared answer. Caleb moved through it like a ghost himself, silent, detached, the rifle slung across his shoulder like dead weight. Logan trailed close, pale and shaken. At the command tent, faces turned toward him. Commanders, analysts, negotiators, they all wanted the same thing: certainty, an explanation, the truth. "Overwatch," the commander barked. "Report who took the shot." Caleb met his eyes. His voice was steady, but inside he felt the ground crumbling. "Unknown shooter. Position undetermined." Murmurs rippled through the tent. Disbelief, suspicion, even anger. But Caleb held his ground. It was the only truth he had. Later, when the chaos thinned and the official reports were being typed into sanitized language, Caleb found himself standing at the edge of the perimeter, staring out across the valley. His breath clouded in the cold, his body exhausted, but his mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment. The silence before the shot, the shimmer in the air, the impossible precision. And the feeling that somewhere, unseen, someone had been watching him as closely as he had been watching the target. It wasn't just a bullet, it was a message. But from who? And why? The questions gnawed at him, heavier than any rifle he'd ever carried. He knew this night would divide his life into two halves, everything before the impossible shot and everything after. Because deep down, Caleb understood something terrifying. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. How do you investigate a ghost? That was the question gnawing at Caleb as he stood inside the cordoned-off perimeter hours after the shot. The night had settled cold and unforgiving, washing the valley in moonlight and pale blue shadows. Emergency crews had mostly packed up. Reporters were pushed behind barricades. The hostage families were being ushered into vans, wrapped in blankets, their faces hollow with the kind of relief that looked too much like grief. But inside the floodlit crime scene, the work was only beginning. Dr. Layla, the FBI's lead ballistics expert, knelt beside corpse with tweezers steady in her latex-covered hands. She was known for her precision, her cold detachment. Tonight, that precision cracked at the edges. She lifted the recovered round delicately into a small evidence tray. Her brow furrowed, her lips parted then pressed shut again. For a long beat she didn't speak. Finally, "It's pristine." Caleb moved closer. The word sent a chill through him. A .338 Magnum round designed to travel extreme distances, designed to tear itself apart against bone and flesh. Yet here it lay as if it had been plucked off a factory shelf. Smooth copper jacket, no deformation, no scars. "That's not possible," Logan muttered behind him. His voice was tight, thin. "That bullet should be mangled, at least blunted, but that," he swallowed, "that looks new." Doctor glanced up, her dark eyes unsettled. "Exactly." The commander shifted impatiently. "Then what's the explanation? Did someone fire from close range?" "No," answered, shaking her head slowly. "Trajectory says otherwise. Distance is over 2 kilometers. Angle of entry confirms a long shot, but the terminal ballistics don't add up. This round behaved as if the laws of impact didn't apply." The words hung heavy. Even the commander had no retort. Beside her, another figure stepped forward, Dr. Elias Trent, the consulting physicist. He was older, with the kind of absent gaze that belonged to men who spent too much time thinking about numbers bigger than nations. Tonight, though, his gaze was sharp with disbelief. He held a tablet, its holographic projection casting cold light into the night air. A three-dimensional reconstruction of the scene rotated slowly above the device, red lines tracing hypothetical bullet paths. Each one ended in a collision with unyielding concrete. The barriers create what we call a ballistic shadow, he explained, voice low and steady. It means this position was physically protected. No line of sight, no possible trajectory. The target should have been invisible to any shooter in this sector. And yet, Caleb said quietly, he's dead. Trent's mouth tightened. Yes, which means one of two things. Either our data is wrong, or we're dealing with a capability so far beyond our own it borders on science fiction. No one laughed. Caleb's eyes drifted back toward the crane. Its rusted skeleton stood against the horizon like a sentinel, unmoving, indifferent. He couldn't shake the shimmer he'd seen, a flicker of light where there should have been nothing. Search came up empty, Logan said quietly at his side. Ground teams swept the crane, the cab, every platform. No shooter, no equipment, nothing. Caleb's jaw clenched. Someone was there. Logan looked at him, face pale. Then they wanted us to know it. A medic zipped into a black bag, the final punctuation on a nightmare. But the questions remained, swirling like smoke no wind could clear. Later, inside the command tent, the experts pored over data, replaying drone footage, scouring satellite captures. Hours of surveillance collapsed into grainy feeds and dead ends. Then, at exactly 3:47:23 p.m., on one traffic camera overlooking the crane, they found it. A shimmer, barely visible, a distortion in the air like heat rising off asphalt, a ripple that bent the light for a fraction of a second, then nothing. 3 seconds later was dead. Caleb leaned closer to the screen, his pulse quickening. It wasn't a flash, it wasn't recoil, it wasn't anything he'd ever seen. The air itself had blinked. Doctor whispered, "That's an energy signature." Dr. Trent shook his head. Or a mirage, or, he stopped, words catching in his throat, or something else. Caleb said nothing. He didn't trust his own voice. His mind was spiraling, his training colliding with a truth he didn't want to admit. The shot hadn't just been impossible. It had been intentional, crafted. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was art. The forensic team packed up as dawn began to bleed pale light across the horizon. Exhaustion weighed on every man and woman in the tent, but Caleb felt something sharper than fatigue. A pressure behind his ribs, coiled tight, as though the world had shifted on its axis, and he was one of the few who had noticed. He returned to the field one last time, standing alone where had fallen. The concrete still bore stains of his blood. The child's small footprints were frozen in mud nearby, tiny patterns pressed into earth like fragile echoes of survival. Caleb knelt, pressing his fingers lightly against the ground. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if the silence itself had teeth. He glanced toward the crane, and for a heartbeat, he swore he saw movement, just a flicker, a suggestion of shadow. By the time he raised his rifle, there was nothing. But something remained. Near the crane's ladder, nestled in debris, lay a single black hairpin. Small, ordinary, the kind a girl might tuck into her hair without thought. Yet when Caleb picked it up with gloved hands, he felt the weight of intent. It was too deliberate, too placed. And when forensic lights scanned it, a glint revealed a chip embedded deep in its plastic spine. A GPS beacon, military grade. Caleb's pulse spiked. He turned it in his palm, watching the tiny circuitry catch the light. Logan's voice cracked. "It's a marker, coordinates. She wasn't aiming at a man, she was aiming at a point in space. Caleb closed his fist around it, eyes narrowing toward the empty cab above. Whoever had left this hadn't been careless. They had left a breadcrumb, a signature without a name. Not to be found. To be followed. And in that moment, Caleb understood something chilling. This wasn't just about a child's life. This wasn't about. It was about them, him. Someone had taken the rules of his world, ballistics, geometry, physics, and shattered them like glass. And then, with precision almost cruel, had left behind a single clue. An invitation. What kind of sniper leaves breadcrumbs? The question chased Caleb as the convoy rolled through the sleeping city, red and blue lights flickering against faceless buildings. Hours had passed since the impossible shot, yet the world around him felt no less strange. His rifle rested between his knees, but he didn't grip it for reassurance. It felt useless now. On the seat beside him, Logan tapped nervously at his tablet, cross-referencing coordinates from the tiny GPS chip embedded in the hairpin. The signal traced a line not to the crane, but 15 miles east, an abandoned freight distribution warehouse, long forgotten by anyone except the rats and the wind. "Boss," Logan said, his voice uneven, "this doesn't make sense. If she wanted to disappear, she could vanish without a trace. No one would found her. But instead," he trailed off, eyes flicking toward the evidence bag resting in Caleb's lap. Inside, the hairpin gleamed faintly under the convoy's interior lights. "She left us a trail." Caleb didn't answer. His gaze was locked out the window, where streetlights blurred into streaks of pale yellow. Every instinct screamed that following was the wrong move, but instinct hadn't saved hostages. Instinct hadn't fired the impossible shot. When they arrived, the warehouse loomed like a grave. Rusted fences leaned at crooked angles. Weeds pierced through cracked asphalt. The wide concrete shell stood hollow against the night sky, windows fractured into jagged smiles. Floodlights cut across painting it in harsh white as the tactical team fanned out. "Clear perimeter," a voice crackled through radios. "No movement." Caleb and Logan stepped inside with the first wave. Their boots echoed across the vast, empty expanse, sound swallowed by shadows. Dust hung in the air like suspended breath. The silence was suffocating. Then Logan's beam swept across the floor and froze. "Boss." There in the center of the cavernous space lay a single spent casing. Caleb approached slowly, heart thudding. A .338 Magnum round, identical to the pristine bullet recovered from his body. But this casing was warm, fresh, as though it had been fired minutes ago, though there had been no sound, no echo, no shot. He crouched, letting his gloved hand hover above it. He could feel the heat radiating upward, faint but undeniable. Doctor, arriving with her forensics kit, dropped to her knees beside him. Her eyes widened. "This matches. Rifling marks are identical. Same weapon, same shooter." Logan swung his flashlight in wide arcs, chasing shadows across the warehouse. "But this doesn't line up. There's no from here, no trajectory to, nothing but farmland between this place and the target zone. It's," his voice cracked into a laugh that wasn't humor, "it's impossible all over again." Caleb's eyes caught on something else. Just beside the casing, etched into the concrete floor itself, were words, not scratched, not painted, burned. Perfectly carved letters glowing faintly in the light. "Some shots demand silence. Some justice leaves no trace." The message cut deeper than any bullet. Doctor bent low, tracing the edges with her gloved fingertips. Her breath trembled. "This wasn't acid. The edges are too clean, too precise. This was done with energy, a laser maybe, but there's no power source here, no equipment, nothing." Caleb stared at the words until they blurred. He thought of the child, her eyes trusting him through the scope. He thought of, collapsing into silence not because of his trigger but because of hers, whoever she was. He whispered it before he could stop himself. "She's not hiding, she's teaching." Logan shot him a wary glance, teaching what? Caleb lifted the warm casing, feeling its weight. That we don't understand the rules anymore. They searched the warehouse for hours. Every corner, every rusted beam, every broken crate, nothing else. No footprints, no equipment, no human trace at all. Only the casing, still faintly warm in Caleb's palm, and the words into the concrete like scripture. By dawn, they conceded the search. Agents packed their gear in silence. The warehouse swallowed its secrets once again. But for Caleb, the night had already shifted something inside him. This wasn't just an unsolved case. It wasn't just an impossible shot. It was a dialogue. Someone out there was rewriting the laws of physics with a rifle, and they wanted him to know it. As the convoy rolled away, he pressed his forehead against the cold window, eyes half closed. The city was waking outside. People rushing to work, sipping coffee, oblivious that their world had tilted just slightly off its axis. Logan broke the silence. "Boss, what if this isn't about it all? What if this is about us?" Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because deep down, he already knew. What do you do when the truth is too heavy for paper? 3 weeks after the impossible shot, Caleb sat alone in his apartment, the city lights flickering through half-open blinds. The room was sterile, stripped of warmth, bare walls, a table from years of coffee mugs and takeout cartons, a couch that sagged under the weight of a man who hadn't slept. On the table lay the spent casing from the warehouse, not in an evidence bag, not logged, not, he had kept it, a violation of every oath he had sworn, every line he had never crossed in 20 years of service. Yet the truth was simpler. He couldn't let it go. His eyes traced the brass, still carrying the memory of warmth. He had turned it over 1,000 times, searching for meaning in grooves and marks that mocked his training. Rifling patterns matched the impossible bullet pulled from skull. Same weapon, same ghost. But the official report, the one filed neatly in the FBI's database, read like a work of fiction. Unknown sniper eliminates threat from undetermined position. A line of bureaucratic ink that scrubbed away everything terrifying, everything miraculous. No mention of pristine bullets, no mention of shimmering air, no mention of words burned into concrete. It was a sanitized lie. And Caleb lived with the poison of the truth. Nights became a battlefield. Sleep brought only visions, bullets bending like serpents through the air, cutting arcs across impossible distances. Dreams where his manic eyes shifted into his own reflection in the scope, where the child's silent plea echoed into screams. He would wake drenched in sweat, copper on his tongue, his chest pounding as though the shot had just been fired again. Logan had tried to talk about it once. He'd sat across from him at a diner, pushing eggs around a plate he never touched. "Boss, maybe we let this one go. Maybe we don't chase ghosts." Caleb hadn't answered, because letting go meant pretending it hadn't happened, and pretending meant living inside the lie. That night his phone buzzed, an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but the message was simple. "Roofed up now. Come alone. Bring the casing." Caleb's throat tightened. He read it 3 times, the letters burning brighter with every pass. His first instinct was to call it in, to loop command, to bury it in protocols. But protocols hadn't saved the girl. Protocols hadn't pulled the trigger. This was different. This was her. Against every instinct screaming trap, he took the casing, slid his service weapon into its holster, and climbed the narrow stairwell to the roof. The December wind hit him like a blade, bitter, unrelenting. The city stretched beneath him, alive with 1,000 lights, each one oblivious to the storm building inside his chest. And then he saw her. She stood at the edge of the roof, silhouetted against neon and night, her frame slender still, a shape of shadow and starlight. She didn't turn when he approached. Her presence was both fragile and terrifying, like standing near the eye of a storm. Caleb stopped 10 feet away. His hand hovered near his weapon, though he knew instinctively it was useless. When she spoke, her voice was low, calm, threaded with an accent he couldn't place. Eastern Europe, maybe. Russian softened by years of something else. "You've been asking questions, Agent." His breath caught. The air itself seemed to tighten around her words. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, unsteady. "How did you make that shot?" She turned then. The city's glow caught her face, angular, sharp, beautiful in a way that suggested danger more than comfort. But it was her eyes that froze him. Eyes that carried the weight of 100 impossible kills, of knowledge no human should hold. She looked young, no older than mid-30s, but her gaze was ancient. "The shot was impossible because you were thinking like a sniper," she said softly, "instead of thinking like physics." Caleb blinked. "Physics? You assume bullets must travel straight, that distance is a barrier, that cause must come before effect. But distance, time, they are not absolute, they are suggestions." His mouth went dry. "That's insane. Bullets don't curve, they don't travel through time." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not mocking but patient, like a teacher correcting a stubborn student. "The bullet didn't travel in a straight line, Agent. It was fired from a place of perfect silence, then delivered to where it was needed. You saw the casing. You saw the crane. The shot was not fired from there. It was sent there. At the moment of need, it was delivered to the target. All I did was set the parameters." Caleb felt his pulse hammer. He tried to ground himself, but her words stripped the ground from under him. "You're saying you can tell a bullet where to go." Her eyes flicked toward the casing in his hand. "Not tell it, guide it, shape it. Justice does not always require distance to obey your rules." He stared at her, 1,000 questions clawing at his throat. "What are you?" She stepped closer, her voice steady. "I am what happens when someone refuses to accept that justice has limitations." The wind tore between them, a howl that carried every unasked question into the night. Caleb's breath fogged in the cold, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible with the flesh-and-blood woman standing before him. "But why save the girl? Why reveal yourself to me?" Her expression shifted, softer, yet no less terrifying. "Because some shots require witnesses. Some truths must be remembered, even if they can never be recorded." Her eyes lingered on him, piercing, unflinching. "Someday you will face another impossible choice. And when you do, you will remember that impossible is just a word for what hasn't been done yet." Before he could move, before he could demand more, she stepped backward into the void. Caleb lunged to the edge, but below there was nothing, no body, no trace, only the endless hum of the city, indifferent and eternal. He stood there, the casing warm in his pocket, his chest heaving as the cold swallowed him whole. Maya. He didn't know how he knew her name, but it was etched now, as sharp and undeniable as the words burned into the warehouse floor. She was no myth, no accident. She was a ghost. And she had chosen him. What do you do when the ghost chooses you? Caleb sat in silence, staring at the casing on his kitchen table. The brass caught the dim light, reflecting it in a way that felt alive, like a pulse beneath metal. He had carried it back from the roof in his pocket, though his fingers trembled every time he touched it. The apartment around him was quiet but not peaceful. The quiet pressed down on him like a weight. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her silhouette balanced on the edge of the roof, her voice whispering that impossible was just another word for what hadn't been done yet. The casing was more than evidence now. It was a tether, a reminder that he had not just seen her, he had been seen. The Bureau wanted closure, commanders wanted certainty. The official file was already stamped and sealed. Case closed. Terrorist neutralized by an unidentified sniper. End of story. But Caleb knew better. He carried the truth in his chest like a burning coal. The truth was a poison that refused to stay buried. Logan noticed the change first. On their next assignment, he caught Caleb staring too long through his scope, his focus fractured. "You're not here," Logan muttered one night as they cleaned their rifles. "You're chasing her." Caleb said nothing, but the silence was answer enough. Logan shook his head. "Boss, she's not our mission. Whatever she is, whatever she's doing, it's bigger than us. You keep going down this road, it's gonna eat you alive." Caleb finally met his eyes. "She's not just a shooter, Logan. She's rewriting the rules, and she wants me to see it. Why me?" Logan dropped his gaze back to the rifle in his lap. "Maybe because you'll follow. Maybe because you're predictable." The words stung because they rang true. The bureau debriefings grew colder, shorter. He gave them the official answers, nothing more. He learned to wear a mask, but inside doubt consumed him. Was Maya even human? Or was she something else entirely, an experiment, a weapon, a fragment of something that belonged to the future, not the present? At night the dreams worsened. Not the little girl, dreams of her. Standing in impossible positions, rifle angled through geometry that should have been solid. Bullets bending like liquid light, carving paths through walls, air, even time itself. Her eyes never wavered, always on him. One night he woke to find the casing gone from the table. Panic clawed at his chest until he found it, not stolen but placed carefully on the windowsill. He lived alone. No one had been inside. Yet somehow the casing had moved. He gripped it in his fist until his knuckles whitened, a desperate attempt to reclaim some measure of control. But deep down, he knew control had been stripped from him the night fell. The next message came days later, not on his phone this time but handwritten. A slip of paper slid under his door. "You're looking in the wrong direction." No signature, no trace, just ink on paper, stark and final. Caleb stared at it for hours, every fiber of his training screaming at him to report it, to treat it as evidence. But he didn't. He burned it in his sink, watching the flames curl the edges until they crumbled to ash. He couldn't explain why. Maybe because the note wasn't a threat, it was a lesson. The Bureau reassigned him soon after. Officially, it was to give him distance from the case. Unofficially, they had started to see the cracks. He was quieter, more withdrawn. His reports became clipped, vague. He stopped offering analysis in briefings. Colleagues whispered that he'd lost his edge. But the truth was worse. He hadn't lost his edge. He had seen it sharpened into something inhuman, wielded by hands that weren't bound by law or physics. On his last night before reassignment, he found himself on the roof again, staring into the city's void. He wanted her to appear, needed her to, needed answers, but the skyline gave him only silence. He spoke anyway. His voice was hoarse against the wind. "Why me?" No answer. And yet deep down he felt her, watching, listening. Somewhere between belief and madness he understood. He wasn't hunting her anymore. She was shaping him. The next day the casing was gone, vanished, no broken locks, no footprints, just absence. And for the first time, Caleb wondered if he'd ever had it at all, or if she had only lent it to him, a teacher placing chalk in the hand of a student. What terrified him most wasn't the loss, it was the feeling of relief. Because if the casing was gone, maybe the burden wasn't his anymore. But that hope was short-lived. 2 weeks later, another impossible shooting surfaced. Different city, different target, same calling card. A tyrant silenced mid-speech, his skull ruptured in front of 100 cameras. No flash, no report, just silence and blood. And when the footage arrived on Caleb's desk, though it should never have reached him, though his clearance had been revoked, there was a note clipped to it. "Some shots demand witnesses." The handwriting was the same, precise, almost calligraphic. Caleb's chest hollowed. He realized then that he had never been relieved of the burden. The casing, the messages, the rooftop, they weren't the end. They were initiation. Maya hadn't chosen him because of who he was. She had chosen him because of what he would become. What happens when justice stops asking for permission? Caleb sat in the back of an unmarked SUV, watching grainy footage loop on a tablet screen. The images were shaky, recorded on a dozen different phones. A tyrant on a stage, flanked by banners and bodyguards. His voice rose, arrogant and certain, his fist slamming into the podium. Then, mid-sentence, his head snapped back, and the microphone screeched as his body collapsed forward. No sound of a gunshot, no muzzle flash from any visible angle, just silence, and then chaos. The crowd had screamed, cameras had cut away, but the truth was undeniable. Another impossible shot. Another message. Logan sat beside him, jaw tight. It's her, no question. Caleb didn't respond. He replayed the footage again, his finger pausing at the exact frame where the man's skull ruptured. The same precision, the same surgical cruelty, no collateral, no chance of survival. She's not random, Logan continued. She's targeting people, monsters. This guy, they're not innocent men. They've all got blood on their hands. Caleb's voice was low, almost to himself. That doesn't make her a savior. Logan glanced at him, uneasy. Then what does it make her? The SUV hummed with silence, the question hanging between them like smoke. Later, at the Bureau's temporary command post, Caleb kept to himself. Analysts pored over trajectories, drones, acoustic data, and still came up with nothing. Reports stacked high on desks, each one reaching the same sterile conclusion: unknown shooter, method undetermined. The room buzzed with frustration, but Caleb felt something colder: resignation. They weren't chasing a sniper, they were chasing a ghost. When the meeting broke, he found himself alone in the hall, leaning against the wall like a man twice his age. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, relentless, artificial. And then a voice. "You don't believe their reports." He turned sharply. She was there. Maya. No warning, no sound, just presence, sudden and undeniable. She leaned casually against the far wall, her dark hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. Caleb's throat tightened. "You shouldn't be here." Her lips curved slightly. "And yet I am." Every instinct screamed at him to call it in, to raise the alarm. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're killing men in front of cameras. You're sending messages. Why?" Maya's eyes held his without flinching. "Because their crimes hide behind walls. Courts won't touch them. Politics shields them. Paper shields them, but physics doesn't. And sometimes dignity requires silence. A single shot, a reminder that they are not untouchable." Caleb's chest ached. "You think you're justice?" "No," her voice softened, though it carried the weight of steel. "I think I'm consequence." He shook his head, anger rising despite himself. "You're playing God." Her gaze didn't waver. "No, Agent, God forgives, I do not." The words struck him like a blow. Maya pushed off the wall and walked past him, her steps soundless. He turned, torn between stopping her and letting her vanish. "Why me?" he called out, his voice cracked, raw. "Why do you keep pulling me into this?" She paused, half-turned, her profile sharp against the sterile light. "Because you still believe truth belongs in reports. I'm here to show you it belongs in silence." And then she was gone. No door, no sound, just gone. Caleb stood frozen, his heart pounding. That night he sat alone in his apartment, pouring whiskey into a glass he didn't drink. Her words replayed over and over, each one carving deeper. Was she right? Were her shots a kind of justice in a world too compromised to deliver it? Or were they executions dressed as miracles? He thought of the child had held at gunpoint, alive because of Maya. He thought of the tyrant on stage, dead before he could order another massacre. How many lives had been saved by a single impossible bullet? And yet he also thought of the silence after, the absence of accountability, the absence of law. If one woman could decide who lived and who died, what separated her from the monsters she hunted? His phone buzzed, a secure line, Logan's voice sharp with panic. "Boss, we've got a problem, another one, it's happening again." Caleb grabbed his coat and rifle, adrenaline cutting through the haze. Another impossible shot. Another ghost-written message in silence. But this time, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just chasing her anymore. He wasn't just a witness. He was beginning to wonder if he was her shadow. And shadows, he knew, were never innocent. What happens when the end feels more like a beginning? Caleb stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley. Wind tore at his jacket, carrying with it the scent of dust and pine, the kind of sharp cold that cuts straight through bone. Below, lights shimmered faintly from a compound buried deep in the forest, tonight's stage for the next impossible shot. Reports said the man inside was a war criminal who had slipped through tribunals, escaped borders, and bought his way out of consequences. Rumors said Maya was already here, waiting, watching. Caleb had been sent with a team to establish Overwatch. Officially, it was another operation to gather intelligence. Unofficially, he knew why he was here. She wanted him to see. Logan crouched beside him, scanning through binoculars. His voice was low, tense. No clean line, place is fortified, no shot possible from this angle. Caleb didn't answer. He felt it, the stillness in the air, the quiet that came before her presence. And then it happened. The man below stepped out into the open courtyard, flanked by guards. A laugh carried faintly upward, the sound of arrogance, of safety. Caleb braced, scope trained, his breath slowing instinctively, but he wasn't the one who would pull the trigger. He knew that now. The shot came in silence. No report, no flash, just a flicker in the air, a ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The man collapsed instantly, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. Panic erupted below. Guards scrambled, shouting into radios. Searchlights swept across the cliffs, the trees, the sky, but Caleb didn't flinch. He kept his scope steady. And then, in the corner of his vision, movement. He turned, she was there. Maya stood a dozen yards away, rifle slung loosely at her side, her figure framed by the fading dusk. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. Logan's breath caught. Jesus Christ. But Caleb barely heard him. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stepped forward, each movement heavy with years of questions. "You knew I'd be here," he said. "Yes." "Why?" His voice cracked. "Why me?" Her gaze softened, though her tone remained steady. "Because someone must remember the truth, not the reports, not the lies polished for politics, the truth. That justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives in silence." Caleb's chest tightened. "That's not justice, that's execution." Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. Justice and execution are separated by process, but process fails. Men like him, they hide behind paper shields. They count on hesitation. I remove hesitation. Logan stepped forward, voice trembling with rage. "You're a murderer. You decide who lives, who dies. What gives you that right?" Maya didn't look at him. Her focus stayed on Caleb. "What gives you the right to hold a rifle, agent, to aim at a man's chest, to decide if he lives or dies? Orders, uniforms, protocol. You believe they absolve you. I don't believe in absolution. I believe in consequence." Her words landed like blows. Caleb felt them digging into places he had never allowed himself to question. "You could have disappeared," he whispered. "You could have stayed a myth, but you wanted me to see. Why?" Her voice softened. "Because one day you will face a man you cannot stop by law, a man the system will protect, and in that moment you will remember this. You will remember that impossible is not untouchable." She stepped closer, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "I am not asking you to agree. I am asking you to remember." The silence between them stretched, heavy and unbreakable. Caleb's hand hovered near his rifle, torn between every oath he had sworn and the truth standing in front of him. Logan hissed beside him, "Take the shot, boss. End it right now." Caleb's finger trembled on the trigger, but he couldn't lift the rifle. His heart pounded, his breath fractured. He stared into her eyes, and in them he saw no malice, no triumph, only inevitability. Maya, the ghost, the sniper who bent physics into silence, the consequence the world had tried to forget. And then, without a word, she turned. She walked into the trees, swallowed by shadow, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. Logan cursed under his breath. You should stopped her. Why didn't you? Caleb didn't answer. His throat closed around words that refused to form. He stared into the forest, into the darkness where she had vanished, and felt the weight of her choice pressing into him like a mark. Because he understood now. She hadn't chosen him to kill her. She had chosen him to carry her. Days later, when the report was filed, it looked like every other. Unknown shooter, method undetermined, target eliminated. But Caleb didn't need the words. He had seen the truth. He had heard it in her voice, felt it in the silence that followed each impossible shot. And though he told no one, though he buried it deeper than any secret he had ever carried, he knew it would haunt him forever. Because some truths don't live on paper, some truths don't survive in words. They survive in silence. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.